fellow SPED 2010 students, I hope everyone had a great week last week. I hope you had a good fall break. I know it was very short, only 2 days, but nonetheless, I hope that you were either able to relax or maybe get caught up on some work that you need to catch up on. So with that being said, we are halfway point. I want us to finish the semester strong and keep moving forward. So I thought I'd pull up our course schedule to kind of look at where we are at and kind of where we're headed. So we just finished up Module 6, which was the assessment component. You also submitted are going to submit Sunday, October 20th, your interview or your journal article, whichever one you chose. So now we're moving into Module 7, and we're going to begin working on Module 7. As you see here noted in the calendar, it is a 2-week module because we have 2 chapters that we're working on. Another thing that I wanted to note is that November 1st is the last day to drop a course with a W assigned. So if you feel like you need to drop a course, please make sure that you reach out to your advisor and your financial aid office to see kind of what your options are. But that's why I put that on the calendar. But we are working in 2 chapters, so we have 2 weeks that we will work in Module 7. You'll see here you will be assessed. You will have an IRIS module. You will have to complete a Universal Design for Learning lesson plan, and you will have a quiz, Module 7 quiz. Now, Module 7 quiz will be over the 2 chapters that you will be working in for Module 7. After that, the following 2 weeks of that, you will begin Module 8. That will only be a 1-week module. You will then work in Module 9. And then 10, and then we will finish out the remaining of the semester. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into Module 7 so you'll kind of know what these next 2 weeks look like. So an overview of what we're doing in Module 7 is all about how do you plan instruction for diverse learners. So when we're looking at When we're looking at our module, I always want you to make sure you have all of your keywords and concepts. Now, the keywords and concepts here are really related to the 2 chapters we're working on. So we're working in Chapter 8, and we are also working in Chapter 10. So you'll see here that all of the definition terminology that you would need to know or that you will see are located in those 2 chapters. Another thing that I give you as resources are the 2 chapter PowerPoints. The 2 chapter PowerPoints are listed there for you. You have one for Chapter 8 and Chapter 10. Now, required reading, obviously you're going to be reading out of the textbook teaching in today's inclusive classrooms, but you will focus on Chapter 8 and Chapter 10. I also provide you with looking at the standards so you can kind of see what standards are going to be covered. So we have the standards for in-task, the teacher preparation standards, as well as the standards for Council for Exceptional Children. So you can see kind of what our focus will be for this module. Now, how are you going to be assessed? Now, I did include here an IRIS module. This IRIS module is talking about accommodations. Now, why is that important? Well, in Chapter 8 and Chapter 10, we're focusing on planning instruction, and part of that is do we have to plan for accommodations? So presentation accommodations, what would that look like, right? So we're looking at the learner, right, and some common barriers that you would see with some example accommodations that might work for those students. For instance, if you have a student who has trouble decoding text, you could give them accommodations where you have a text-to-speech software, or you could use an audiobook or a human reader that can help read them. Maybe you have someone that has trouble remembering information. So graphic organizers and visual cues is a really good way to support that student through accommodations. So really this table here is something that I suggest you take note of because this is really useful for students. The other thing is that it really talks about the purpose, right, of accommodation or strategies, and what would be some examples of that. And then it gives you some examples of presentation accommodations that teachers can help support students. So you have different age, like you have one of age 10, one of 15, and one of 6. So you have elementary, middle, and then you will have more like your high school students. So the rest of the IRIS module is how do you respond with accommodations, how do you set them up, looking at maybe timing and scheduling accommodations and how that would work, how do you go about implementing those accommodations, and how do you evaluate the effectiveness to see if they're actually working. So you will walk through this module. There is an assessment. The thing that I want you to note is that when you click on the IRIS module, it's not going to ask you to actually submit a note sheet. I still would like you to complete the assessment. I feel like it's a great way to get feedback to see how you did, right? But you won't be submitting the assessment, but I still would like you to complete it to gain a bigger understanding of where you are and if you actually understood it. You obviously will have your Module 7 quiz. It will be over chapters 8 and 10. But what I am going to assess you on, in addition to the quiz, is going to be the UDL lesson plan. So I wanted to take a minute and go over that. Now remember, you will be needing to use your textbook to complete this assignment. Okay, so make sure you have your textbook opened up. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to be creating a lesson plan using the Universal Design for Learning components. Now, after you read both chapters 8 and 10, and you've completed the IRIS module, then I would sit down and work on this UDL lesson plan. So you're going to actually be using a table inside of your textbook in chapter 8, and the table you're using is 8.6. Okay, so it'll be on page 205. And you'll see here table 8.6, lesson planning elements with UDL components. So this table is really important when you are creating a UDL lesson plan. We want to make sure we have the right components. Now, I will be sending everyone a lesson plan template. It's the one that we did back a few modules ago. We're going to use the same kind, but we're really focusing on including all of these elements. So it may be similar, but it might be a little bit more in depth, okay? So any lesson is always going to have what we call an anticipatory set, and that is your hook. How do you engage the students right away? It's that first few seconds or a minute or so of the lesson, right? And it's going to ask you, if you're using the anticipatory set and a hook, what would those UDL procedures and materials look like, right? What would you be using? Would it be pencil, paper, document camera, pictures, objects, links, videos? What would be your hook? Then you have to think about all your students. What are some possible barriers to learning, right? So within your anticipatory hook, say students very disruptive and they call out all the time, right? One of the methods for that is to use expectation behavior chart or use a focus behavior chart, right? Say that a student lacks background material. You would provide them with background material. Say a student is not very organized. An outline would help them with assignments. So that's just some examples of the anticipatory set. The second element that you look at when you're creating a Universal Design for Learning lesson plan is your input, right? So what we mean by that is, are you preparing your questions for the students ahead of time? Are they relevant? How are you presenting the content to the student? Is it accurately? Is it clearly? And are you using direct instruction? So going back here, when we're looking at this, when we say UDL procedures and materials, right, these are the things that I want you to look at. Are you providing examples and non-examples? Are you allowing them time to brainstorm? Are they getting to work with the partner? Do you want them to share with the whole group? What kind of materials are you using, right? And then we go back to that. What are some possible barriers and challenges, right? So yeah, you may be using a presentation, but if a student has low vision, what are you doing about that? So over here in this last column, it's going to give you examples of how to kind of combat that. What would be some guidelines under UDL that you can help them, right? So maybe a student needs social interaction. Well, you sit them near you while you're doing the lesson. Or maybe they have a language challenge. Well, maybe you're able to provide it in multiple language, right? Or a translation available for them. So you'll see as you work through the table, it's going to have these elements. You're going to look at what part of the lesson are you working on, the teaching lesson. What are you doing? What are some barriers? And what are some guidelines under UDL that can help you with those barriers? The third one, is guided practice. So in every lesson, you have your anticipatory hook, right? The first part. Then you have the teacher lesson. Then you have guided practice. This is where you allow the students to have practice with the new skill they're learning, okay? The activity that you're helping them practice has to be relevant to what you taught them. And they have to be observable. So if you want them to do something, you need to be able to measure that and observe it. So what are some ways that you can do guided practices? Well, during this time, you need to make sure you're providing feedback. You make sure the students know what their responsibility is during this. You have to provide directions that are clear and accurate. Provide them with choices. And you're monitoring during this time and going around to see if they need help. Now here's some materials that you could use during guided practice, right? And then next we look at barriers. What are things that can happen, challenges during guided practice? Well, students who don't remember or don't attend class regularly, that could be a barrier. Students who give up and frustrated very easily. Students who prefer kinesthetic hands-on activities or have different learning modalities, that should be considered for guided practice. And then are they able to master it, right, with guidance? So that scaffolding is still there. So how would you do that? So any kind of barrier you have under UDL, under the column, it's going to give you some examples of how you can go through and walk through those things, right? And then the next section is independent practice. This is where everyone can practice on their own, right? You should be able to have students work on this alone after guided practice. Right? It has to be relevant to what you were talking about and teaching them. You have to be able to collect this as an individual assessment, right? So this could be different ways that you want to. Maybe you want to use digital clickers. Maybe you want to have an oral discussion. Maybe pencils, markers, or chart paper. How are you going to grade this? Then we look at the barriers when we talk about independent practice, right? Maybe they can't write very well or spell very well. Well, then maybe you pair them with a student to help them. Maybe they have difficulty working in group. Well, maybe you need to sit them alone. Maybe they need immediate feedback or to stay on task. Then you can use cues and signals to help them. Maybe they're not very organized. Well, maybe you can help keep them with a checklist. So there's different things you can do under UDL to help with each part of your lesson. The last part of the lesson plan is going to be your closure, your evaluation, right? So how do you know the student was able to master that lesson objectives? And thinking also about what adaptations or accommodation would you make for next time? Okay, so what did the students learn? Can you share their products? And what kinds of questioning was going on during the lesson? What kind of discussions were being had, and you making a checklist or writing anecdotal notes. Again, this third column is really concentrating on any kind of barriers or challenges that you will be noticing during this lesson, right? When you're evaluating them. If they have difficulty writing, maybe you allow for oral presentations. Maybe if they needed modified or extended time, you will be able to use that and make sure that that's included in the rubric of how you're grading them. Maybe they have a behavior plan, so make sure you are having like focused tasks or organization cards and check for behavior during this time. Okay, so though this in your book, this table 8.6 is really relevant and important for you to go through this first before you're able to fill out the lesson plan. Now let's get back. With that being said, and now that we kind of walked through the table together, I want you to see kind of what the objectives are and what you have to do with the scenario I give you. So the first thing is, when you sit down to write your UDL lesson plan, which I'll be sending to you, you think about your learners, you go through the tables, their strengths, the preferences. I give you the scenario here. It's about 11-year-old Liam, and he's in your 6th grade classroom, and he's being diagnosed with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and he's a combined type. Now, he has difficulty paying attention, he still remains motivated, and he does complete academic tasks, but he's frequently disruptive in the classroom. So you want to address his unique challenges, and at the same time, you want to make learning opportunities available to him and to all your students, because remember, he is disruptive. So you have to focus on integrating those UDL components in that table into a lesson plan for your next reading unit. So this is going to be a reading lesson plan. You're going to use table 8.6, and I would focus on the deficit or the barrier that Liam has. Now, once you figure out what his barrier is, motivation, organization, language, we said that it is difficulty paying attention and he's frequently disruptive. So I'd mostly concentrate on that when I'm looking at barriers. And then I'm going to design a lesson to tailor fit Liam, right? Here's your scenario. And you have to make sure your lesson objective and assessment are really clearly stated, right? So here's how you do the focus of the assignment. You're going to create a lesson plan using the UDL components. Remember, all these components have to be in your lesson plan. You have to have anticipatory set. You've got to have teacher instruction, which is your teacher input. You've got to have guided practice, independent practice, and then you need your closure and your evaluation. So all those elements have to be included in your lesson plan, okay? So the first thing to do is identify one UDL method for each stage of the lesson plan, right? So for instance, when you're working on introducing the lesson, that would be under here, which would be your hook, right? Your anticipatory set, that would be introducing the lesson. So what would be a good method, a UDL method for Liam, right? Since we know what his barrier is, what would be a good method we could use during that part of the lesson? In the teacher input or the teacher lesson where you're teaching them, we know what Liam's barrier is. What would be a good method for you to use during that part of the lesson plan? And you would list it. Guided practice, again, what would be a UDL method we could use for Liam during guided practice? Independent practice for Liam, what would be a good UDL method we could use during this part of the lesson? And then evaluation and closure, again, what would be a good UDL method we could use, right? So we're really going to tailor the first two columns of the lesson plan, just like we have here, right, as examples. We want to tailor it toward Liam. Now, the self-evaluation, I ask you to read it because I really want you to get the overall gist of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to use those universal design for learning methods to support all of our students, right, and accommodate them. So for each item of your lesson plan, you know, introducing your lesson, teacher input, which is your teacher lesson itself, your guided practice, your independent practice, your closure and evaluation, for each part, make sure you're addressing Liam's barriers. That's number one. I have it listed here. Address the issues in the scenario. You get those by looking at those UDL methods, right, in each section. Then you need to make sure you give evidence from the chapter supporting this component. Now, you could look at the chapter. In this section where you start on page 205 is a great way where it explains about guided practice. What should you consider? And really makes you look at that. So looking in your textbook to think about justifying how this is really going to improve your teaching and support Liam, right? So just describing and justifying how you're going to support Liam and how this lesson plan using UDL guidelines and methods are going to help you. Okay, and that's the main goal of I will be sending it to you. I also will be putting it not in on the course homepage. That way you'll have it. That lesson plan is just a template. You still got to make sure you have the following components in your lesson plan, right? You still got to have your anticipatory set. You still got to have your teacher input, which is your whole group lesson, what you're going to be teaching them. You still got to have your guided practice, independent, and then your closure and your evaluation, right? And then you're going to submit this to the Dropbox. And it will say, it's going to say lesson plan using UDL components. Now you'll see it's not due to November 3rd, but that's because, like I mentioned, it's going to be a 2-week module. So you have that much time to get chapter 8 and chapter 10 read and then complete your IRIS module. And I would consider doing that before I ever started doing the UDL lesson plan. All right. Okay, so that gets us finished with module 7. You again have 2 weeks to work on this. I hope everyone has a great 2 weeks, and please feel free to reach out should you need any support or have any questions about the lesson plan. All right, guys, until next time, take care.